Alex Galbraith is the gridiron expert. Please join him there on his YouTube channel for his take on college football, and which also includes the Heisman race. So for me, Alex, it's the most prestigious award in all of sports. I appreciate you diving into the fray and giving it a look preseason and then updating your selections and giving it additional updated takes throughout the season as the season progresses and different players step up or fade from the race. I also think it's the most political award because we know that in the NFL, back who is completely nameless, or a running back or a wide receiver, of course, the defense doesn't have much of a shot to win an MVP. So there's an issue there. But out of the skill position players, you could be a complete unknown in the NFL. But if you put up the best numbers, if you play the best, you're going to win the award. In the Heisman Trophy race, there seems to be a pre-selected group of players that unless somebody just comes out of nowhere and completely annihilates the field, that it's a predetermined selection committee or a predetermined group of players that we're going to choose from. So we've got Baker Mayfield. JT Barrett slid out of the race with the loss to Oklahoma. Maybe he plays himself back in, but probably not. Of course, Saquon Barkley seems to be in the lead. We've forgotten to a large extent about Mayfield since the win in Columbus has faded to a certain extent. Sam Darnold, too many interceptions, and we could go down the list. How do you size it up? We're just about halfway through. Some teams have played 7 games. How does the Heisman race stand from your eyes right now?
I think the clear front runner right now has to be Saquon Barkley from Penn State. I mean, he's just done everything, whether it's running, receiving. He even threw a couple passes. I think when they played that game against Indiana, even in the kickoff game, returned a kickoff in that game. He's got to be the front runner for me right now. Yes, Baker Mayfield is still in the mix, I think. He's done great things at Oklahoma. Like you said, we kind of forgot about him. He slipped off after that huge win at Columbus. When they lost to Iowa State a couple weeks ago, a lot of people said he tried to do everything by himself. And he doesn't have that great of a supporting cast in the run game. So he kind of does have to do a lot by himself. And when you do a lot by yourself, you're bound to make mistakes, whether it's through turnovers or just not getting the team down the field. But I still think he's in the running right now. Bryce Love is one of those guys that you mentioned that just kind of came out of nowhere. No one had him pegged as a Heisman contender. And yet here he is from Stanford. I think he's in the mix for sure. One of the best rushers in the nation. I think he has one of the most yards by any running back in the nation right now. Originally, I had Mason Rudolph from Oklahoma State, maybe even Luke Falk as a sleeper, and I think both of those quarterbacks have dropped out for now. Luke Falk had a horrible game last week against California. I think he had 5 interceptions, something like that. And Mason Rudolph, same thing. After that TCU game, which made him look human, because in the preseason or before he played any conference games, he looked unstoppable. But I think those are your big 3, Barkley, Mayfield, and Bryce Love. Don't forget about Rashad Penny and the Mountain West from San Diego State. He didn't have a great game against Boise State last week, but he's still in the mix as well. So I think those are my top 4, mostly running backs, but there's still plenty of time for someone to emerge and surprise us all, just like Lamar Jackson did last year.
As you know, Alex, sports fans, college football fans in particular, seem to be prisoners to the moment and the most recent games. So not just in the Heisman race, as you mentioned, Luke Falk and also Jake Browning, considering his season last year, was given some consideration going into this season. From a team perspective as well, Washington State kind of written off as college football playoff contenders, and maybe they aren't good enough to get there. But I find it funny that after one loss, where they still have a clear path to get to and win the Pac-12 championship, that they're so quickly written off after one loss. And obviously those teams are going to play each other. They're going to play Stanford, and they control their own destiny to win a Pac-12 championship with one loss. But we're so quick to dismiss. And the same, to a certain extent, has happened with, as you mentioned, Mason Rudolph and Oklahoma State in particular, and even Oklahoma, although with a name brand and a recent win against Texas, back amongst the conversation for a college football playoff berth, and of course a game with TCU upcoming. I think people might be surprised, Alex, that in 6 games this year, Saquon Barkley has two 100-yard games. Now, of course, the one came in the most high publicized game, the one that they had to win on the last play of the game at Iowa, in which he was just a monster in that game with 211 yards and also ripped it up with 12 receptions and some big plays in the return game. So in addition to the stats, your team has to win, plus you have to post a few memorable plays throughout the season in huge games, typically, to get yourself in position. I think Lamar Jackson's situation and his run to the Heisman, a bit of an aberration last year because he lost the big games down the stretch. His team played out of contention and he basically won it, and there was just nobody else that caught him, and his statistics were just so overwhelming. And the highlight plays, even though they weren't in big games, the highlight plays were just so overwhelming and memorable as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're exactly right. I mean, I was kind of myself, I was a skeptic at first when Lamar Jackson racked up, I think, 7 touchdowns against Charlotte. I kind of sat to myself, and they were saying, he's a dark horse for the Heisman. I thought, it is Charlotte, though. We have to keep that in mind. It's not that big a deal, but he kept doing it against better teams as the season went on. But this season, if we're to continue to talk about Lamar Jackson, I think a lot of people wrote him off very quickly after that Clemson game. He still put up good numbers, but Louisville just didn't show up for that game. I think some people had them pegged to upset the Tigers with it being at home and with Lamar Jackson leading that team. But you're right. You can't write off a team. You can't write off a player after one game. People and teams have bad games every now and then. They probably shouldn't happen, and it's not good for that team to lose a certain game. I go back to that thing about that Washington game that you mentioned. Last year, they did lose to USC late in the season, and Washington's schedule was very, very weak for the most part, with the exception of a couple teams. Lost to USC late or mid-November. People thought they were out of the playoff race, but they were able to sneak back in, winning the big Pac-12 championship, and they made the playoff, losing to Alabama, of course. So one game does not obviously define a team's season, and one game doesn't obviously corrupt a team's season or a player's Heisman hope at all.
Yeah, for the Heisman, I think it's a different situation. In the position that you are in, trying to forecast the race and predict, you're predicting what somebody else is going to select, or a group of voters, versus just selecting the games, and which is objective to a certain extent, looking at the matchups. And of course, the results on the field are completely objective. We don't have to interpret them. So Washington State don't have to prove to us that they are good enough to win the Pac-12 championship. Well, they've got the opportunity to still, despite awful efforts last week against Arizona State and Cal, they still have the opportunity to go out, because it's an objective system, at least within the conference, to win the conference. Where the Heisman Trophy, I can tell you right now, Lamar Jackson's not winning the Heisman Trophy. He just went out and gained 500 yards against Boston College, but people see the score and that it was BC, and that his team's lost 3 games now, but he's putting up probably close to the same stats as he did last year, but the team is not as successful. And you've got the likes of Baker Mayfield and Saquon Barkley and all the cast that you just mentioned that are going to be playing extremely important games in November. Saquon Barkley, you would think this Michigan game and Ohio State are going to play a huge role in his candidacy and keeping this lead that most of us think he has to win this coveted award. All right, we got Alex Galbraith on the line from the Gridiron Expert. Check out his YouTube channel for his perspective on college football. He does some unique work there on his predictions, his previews of the games, and his look at the Heisman race as well. Alex, we appreciate you stopping by.
Yes, thank you so much.